I spent months building a system that I believed was going to be a long term play until one day the client flipped, took the logins, and ultimately handed it off to someone else. In today's video, I'm going to be going through how I lost it all in one day and how it made me a sharper operator. With the main mission of these videos, as always, is ultimately to build our Thinking OS, basically our internal operating system that governs how we're able to build our backend systems, and also to call in visionaries, basically the people that are aligned with what it is that we're actively striving to solve for, which is chaos, and ultimately to build a network of cool people doing cool things at the same time. So, one of my biggest losses that I've never publicly shared was ultimately when I had, the opportunity to work with this person that was ultimately needing to build, a system that governed how, lead intakes would go and ultimately book a lot more, people into their specific, company. And that was, at the time, it was one of those experiences where I was like, hey, like this is something that is definitely going to be long term. I know that we're building this system and it has a lot of value. But, one of the most important things, through that entire process was that, hey, I was pumped more than anything else to build, like I always am, as always, to always say, hey, like today I'm going to wake up and I'm just going to build this project. And it was one of the most intensive things that, I've ultimately spent time with. I got resources in terms of, team resources, and also for me, my time spending, I spend, so many hours ultimately just cranking out in Figma, just figuring out, hey, like this goes there, this goes there, going over the entire scope, saying, hey, this is how we're actively, building out, the design for this system, and also just going through the entire process, which, at the time, I'm not gonna, look back and say it was all bad and it was all, not worth it, but ultimately I learned a lot more. If I wouldn't, have gone through this specific experience whereby, I was basically kind of, misled in a way, it would have ultimately, not yielded me into the operator that I am today. Because this is was ultimately my biggest lesson, which was, it wasn't a monetary lesson per se, but it was more so a time lesson that I had learned. Because I ultimately spent, months building a system for a client, every single detail, like I said, building out those Figma boards, and ultimately going through this whole entire revision process, and every automation was lined up, only for me to have the flip script, to have the script flipped on me just suddenly. And I think one of the most important things, from, my journey that I've ultimately had, to learn is that not everyone ultimately values your expertise and what you're able to do, and that is okay. It's just then becomes the question of how are you going to respond. There's so many instances where I see like a lot of people, they build something and then they say, hey, like I want to get fairly compensated, which is 100%, true. You do need to get compensated for what it is that you're actively building for. But, ultimately there are people out there that ultimately don't see the specific, value or want to compensate you for the effort that you have made. And I think, those people are ultimately just bad people to work with. And, for me, if I hadn't gone through this specific instance, where we spent so much time, team resources building out this project, only for one day, to be told, hey, can I please have the logins? And then saying, hey, like, why do you need the logins? Okay, it's my client, it's fine. And then handing them over, then 2 days after, you ultimately see, hey, the entire thing that you spend months on building is ultimately vanished. It's gone in the blink of an eye. And I think, for me, I could have gone two ways about it. I could have, cried and said, hey, like this guy didn't pay me, he didn't do anything, and he just ultimately, screwed me over, which was the truth, to be honest with you. And ultimately, for me personally, I see it as one of those learning curves that you ultimately have to learn, and, as a builder that you have to go through. Because in the moment, I am not gonna lie, it ultimately sucked, because it's like, hey, I spent so much time, I had a team that ultimately trusted me to build this, and I was, paying out of pocket as well, because I was like, hey, we're ultimately going to make this money back, we're going to do all these things into the future, and it's going to build that long-term, relationship. But ultimately, some people, you realize that, hey, it's not worth building that relationship with, and ultimately, they don't see the value as well, which ultimately makes you think that, hey, it's okay. Like one of the things that I learned specifically in this instance was there were so many ways I could have gotten, I could have gone better, about this. And for me, I was still young, I was ultimately just learning as well. And I think, for me, I was just like super excited to build. But I think one of the most, important lessons through that I ultimately, had to learn, because of this lesson is ultimately that, that systems can be taken. Ultimately, they can just switch up on you and they can ultimately have this, build that you ultimately were able to build. But the ability to build, they can't. Ultimately, if I looked at it from a perspective of saying, hey, like I've been screwed over, what am I going to do? Am I going to do XYZ? That wouldn't have helped. I think I'm one of those persons, those people that ultimately says, hey, like I've been screwed over and that's okay. I know that, they're probably having the time of their life, enjoying, but ultimately I'm gonna focus on what I can control. I'm gonna focus on myself in terms of how I'm able to create value. If someone, spend months, building something for someone and ultimately they didn't see that value to the point that, they switched up a whole entire custom system that we built out for them for a generic tool, and 100%, you can ultimately, probably get the same functions and the same, functionalities and things like that, with the generic tool that they ultimately opted for. But I think the value, that ultimately our system that we built for them long term would have ultimately yielded them, the results that they wanted. And most of the case, you just realize that, hey, not everyone sees those the value that you have, because they don't see 10-20 years or steps ahead. That ultimately is okay, but you ultimately have to realize that, hey, these losses don't define you. They ultimately, act as a response, a response log. Ultimately how you're able to respond governs how you're able to build. Because for me, I could have looked at it so many ways. I could have, literally just gone public and said, hey, XYZ, screwed me over, and he's very big, in his very respected field. But ultimately playing victim doesn't make you sharper, but building again does. Ultimately, if I, was just going out blasting and saying, hey, this guy screwed me over, like, what was it actively going to do other than to cause drama? And for me, I just wanted to, focus on what I'm best at. And that is ultimately building systems and creating value for my next clients. And, I looked at that situation and that point in time as an inflection point to say, hey, like, what am I actively doing as a person? How am I actively building? Because through this, I realized that there 100% gaps in terms of how I'm able to communicate, within myself. In as much as you can say like, hey, like it's all this guy's fault and all that kind of stuff. For me internally, I realized that, hey, I need to be more tactical in the way that I'm able to work with the people that I'm working in terms of vetting, making sure that, hey, the people that I'm actively working for are people that I want to build relationships with long term and are able to see the value that I actively have to use, and aren't just, all over the place. I think, a lot of structure also comes through that, and making sure that, hey, for me, I want to make sure that I'm able to produce as much value as I possibly can, but at the same time it needs to also ultimately be down to an exchange, because we ultimately, having that exchange, I'm, creating value for you, you ultimately are creating value for me. But ultimately understanding that, this is one of the biggest lessons that, I ultimately had to learn, is just one of those things that you have to take on the chin and say, what, I may not have my day today, I may not have my day, in a month's time, but ultimately my form of, quote unquote revenge is ultimately just building sharper. And I think, I speak a lot, in terms of, having these data points, in terms of how, you need to use these lessons that you're actively learning as, a source of truth to ultimately help you understand and build better. And I think, looking back, if I look back on all the losses, that I've had, I think one of the most, generic themes is that one of the things that, ultimately, plays a huge role in how I was able to combat that was having the mindset of, okay, it is what it is. How am I going to actively just build better into the future? And I think if it wasn't for that, I wouldn't be able to, be having the level of conviction within myself. I think it just comes from that, having that level of conviction to say, hey, no matter what happens, no matter what bad things happen, I'm just going to build anyways, and I'm going to figure it out. Because that is one of the things about me. I'm one of those people that say, hey, bad things are always going to happen, or there's a high probability that bad things will happen into the future, but ultimately, how can you respond? How are you able to find it within yourself to ultimately build better and ultimately come back even stronger? Because I think there's a lot of there's a lot of there's more truth in that, to ultimately say, hey, things are going to happen and I'm ultimately going to be able to respond 10x, and that builds me, or that creates this sharper version of myself. Because if it wasn't specifically for this lesson and instance, when I'm young, I'm hungry, I want to make sure that we're creating value in terms of what it is that we're actively building for our clients, and I just want to make sure that I'm doing the best possible work that I possibly can. And then someone else sees that as in like, hey, like I'm in it, and then they're not in it, and then they're easily swayed simply because it's something that they probably understand, to say, hey, like we actively have this, like let me just work on it, which is okay. You can get your deal done today, but into the future you're probably gonna have to rebuild again, which is okay if you want to take that way. But for me, I also just want to make sure that we're able to just produce as much value as we possibly can. But not everyone sees that, and never ever ever through that life has that experience ever happened again. And I think one of the main tactical principles that I have been able to learn from this experience is ultimately that you should never build without versioning and ownership in mind. And what I mean by this is ultimately that every IP, every stack, every workflow keep a blueprint of it, because ultimately through this blueprint it ultimately allows you to then use this as a data point to ultimately allow you to build better into the future. Because if the system walks away, which in this case it did, the framework still belongs to you. And I think for me, if I just had the mindset of saying, hey, like they took the project and this is how it everything is gone, that wouldn't have yielded me an ROI into the future. But I said to myself, like, hey, I looked at myself in the mirror and I said, hey, your most valuable asset is your value creation. And if someone doesn't see that, or they screwed you over in the short term, then how can I come back in the long term in a manner that ultimately builds me into the version of myself that is sharper, that is the sharpest operator, and solves problems? Because if I didn't have that, I wouldn't have been able to get through that specific point in time to say, hey, that's where the real power of the backend ops is ultimately understanding that it's not just for building for someone else, but rather building in a way that compounds your craft. If I look back and I say, hey, all these things were bad and all that happened, 100%, I 100% look at it from a negative light. But now time has passed and I ultimately understand that, hey, it made me into a sharper operator, because it made me realize that, hey, there's specific gaps that I was missing in terms of communication, in terms of making sure that, hey, I'm being nice, but also being super firm in terms of what the expectations are, and also delivering on those expectations. And also at the same time, you just realize that not everyone has that same outlook to feel bad in terms of compensating adequately for what it is that you're actively doing. And that is okay. You just need to understand that, hey, how can I make sure that this doesn't happen again? And making sure that it makes me sharper, it makes me faster, and makes me more inevitable with every build. Because that day taught me the difference between attachment and resilience, which means that you can attach yourself to a project, or you can attach yourself to the craft. And I chose the craft, and that is why I'm in the game for long term. Because that's why every setback ultimately fuels me to ultimately build better into the future. And I think looking back, I could have said so many times that I lost it all in one day, having this perception of, hey, like I've lost this client, and this person that ultimately was the person that I thought would be best working with long term. But ultimately I realized that, hey, the universe has a funny way of ultimately removing what is not supposed to be in your life, and what ultimately allows you to build better into the future. And I look back on one of these biggest lessons as the learning curves, because you can imagine spending months and months and months of hard work, development, and also design in terms of building out, paying out of pocket on my end, ultimately making sure that, hey, like I'm building this and I'm spending so much time ultimately creating this value. And which it did, it 100% did. It was live for a couple months, and then ultimately he came up to me and he's like, hey, like can I have the logins, and then switch that up. But ultimately, looking at it tactically, it builds the next generation of Killer Chaos OS. Because with my internal operating system, it then refines, this blueprint of mine. Because with this blueprint now, I can use it into the future to ultimately say, hey, this happened, and now it's go time. It's go time in terms of how I'm gonna be able to be a sharper operator and also build into the future. And that is more valuable than any monetary sense you could honestly have. And I think into the future, if it wasn't for this, looking back on this, biggest loss that I've ever, made in terms of, spending time and resources out of my own pocket, I think, I wouldn't be able to be here where I'm at today. And I think that just solely just comes from, solely just having that level of conviction within yourself to say, hey, no matter what happens, no matter what bad things happen, I'm going to build I'm going to build anyways, and I'm going to make sure to become a sharper operator because I love the craft. And that craft is ultimately what's going to get me to the next level. And if you're super attached to the project, you're ultimately going to get crushed. But if you're attached to the craft, you ultimately are in it for the long term. And setbacks like this don't derail you from the main mission, which is ultimately to have this level of impact that we're ultimately gunning for, and also to making sure that we inspire millions of people, and also making sure that we're redefining industries, because I think that future is a lot more worth it in the long term than crying over a small project. And a lot of people could say, hey, like this person screwed me over and stuff like that, but which is okay. But ultimately, how can we become more tactical and make sure that the version of ourselves that builds into the future creates a lot of value for the clients that we're going to be working with? And that's okay. And it's just about thinking in terms of, hey, this is the game is the game. You just need to ultimately sharpen the tool stacks within yourself to make sure that, hey, you're building better, you're scaling better into the future, because ultimately you can only control so much, and through controlling so much, you need to within yourself find that, hey, I want to be the best of the best in the game. So ultimately, I'm just going to make sure that I'm constantly doing the right thing and also creating as much value as I possibly can, because I would never, if anything else, I would never want anyone else to feel the way that I did in that point in time, where, hey, you spend months working on this thing and ultimately someone just comes along and screws you over and stuff like that. And most people don't probably talk about this. It's always the good things that happen, but I think it's all ultimately one of the things that does happen, and you just need to understand how you're able to become more tactical into the future, and also build into also build the OS, the operating system within yourself that gets you to the next level. Because if it wasn't for this, I wouldn't be where I'm at today. I wouldn't have had the lessons and the level of conviction that I have today. So ultimately, I'm super, in as much as it may be counterintuitive, I am super grateful for this experience. And into the future, it's made me a better operator, which ultimately allows me to create a lot more value into the future, and that I can never take away for. So if you guys enjoyed this video, make sure to connect with me on X, Instagram, LinkedIn. Today is day 80, so let's go. 20 more days, or 20 more days, quotation marks, 20 more days to go. And yeah, if you guys like the video, like I said, connect with me on X, LinkedIn, Instagram. Links are in the description, and I will see you guys in the next video.